Welcome, friends, to this very special St. Brigid's Day. We're going to discuss the women behind James Joyce and how they encouraged his achievement. And I'm delighted to be joined by Mary Durkan from the Toronto Bloomsday Festival, but also a great Dublin woman, grew up, as she says, in James Joyce territory, in and around Dublin city centre. Particular focus for Joyce, of course, he moved all around Dublin, but the core of Dublin and indeed Jewish Dublin around Clonbassel Street and the South Circular Road and Rathgar and Droghandra too. But my pleasure to talk to Mary about this subject and very appropriate, I think, for Brigid's Day. But Mary, before we kick off, do you want to just say something about Dublin as you and I remember it? I mean, when I was young, I do remember that the kind of the dealers, antique dealers and so on, Jewish like Dankers and Clonbassel Street. And, you know, when I read Ulysses and I read Joyce in a portrait, it kind of brings back that Dublin that I picked up from my grandfather and grandmother, and the way they kind of, their attitudes and the way they spoke and the way they lived. You must have picked up some of that too from your time in Dublin.
Yeah, and you must remember, I was growing up in Dublin earlier than you. I was growing up in Dublin in the 50s and 60s. So yes, I grew up just around the corner from the synagogue. Actually, from my bedroom looking out, I could see over the canal into the Jewish cemetery. Right. And so when I discovered Ulysses, that was one of its enormous appeals to me, was that this was my Dublin, because when I grew up, the synagogue there was very, very active, and they were Hasidic Jews. And I remember, and I went through the Jewish area, Greenfield Terrace and all of that to get to school. I went to school at the Presentation of Black Pits, and then along Clonbassel Street. So Clonbassel Street, Dolphin's Barn, all of these are referenced, like Rehoboth Terrace. This was all St. Kevin's Parade, was where we had family friends. And so one of my memories from that time is myself and my friend Dolores Ryan. I was fascinated by the Jewish community because it was the only community that was different in Dublin. I mean, it was all very homogeneous apart from that. Anyway, so I was around, it was after we made First Communion. So one Saturday morning, we saw a wedding going into the synagogue. So after the wedding party went in, the two of us saw that the side door was open. So we snuck in up the stairs, and at the top, I still remember the wooden rows of seating. And then right down in the center under a canopy, you could see the bride and groom. That's as far as we got, because we were marched out by the scruff of the neck and told not to come back. And then Dolores and I, you know, we resolved that we wouldn't tell anybody, not even in confession, that we were in the synagogue. Yeah.
Sounds like what you call a bit of skite. But you know, we'll come back to Joyce's fascination with the kind of the Jews of Dublin, most of whom, as we know, were Litvak Jews. But you know, the women in his life, I mean, they are an extraordinary source of support for him, beginning with his mother. I mean, he was very fond of his father, John, but he really did rely on the mother. So the mother was you know, from a Murray, from Longford, but the father was from Joyce, and I think he shared his father's bias for the Joycean roots in County Galway, as opposed to his mother. But nonetheless, his mother seemed to be a source of real stability for Joyce as he was growing up, and as the family were going down socially and economically because of the father's, you know, drinking and lifestyle and lack of employment and so on. And so his mother, with 10 surviving children, 4 boys and 6 girls, she was an extraordinary woman in many ways to tolerate her husband and look after all the kids in extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
Yeah, he does say, there's one thing that he says, amor matris, like mother's love, it's the only true thing in life. And I think that was his experience. And when you see his mother, like the mother that you see in Portrait at the Christmas dinner scene, where things were the very middle class, and it seems she was very musical, played piano and that, but she seemed like a wonderfully warm, caring woman. And I mean, when he was studying in Paris at university, I mean, they had come way down in the world. They had gone from very nice middle class living, you know, and then step by step by step, they lost. They went lower on the social rung. But he would send her these letters, you know, saying how he was starving 24 hours without food or whatever. And she'd scrape together, you know, enough money. And you can just imagine how difficult it was to send him a money order for like 8 shillings. And he mentions it as in the second chapter as he's walking along Sandymount Strand after seeing her, thinking about her death at the deathbed. But he was aware of the sacrifices that she made. I mean, he was her firstborn, and there seemed to have been an incredibly strong bond, and that she took care of him. She would always tell him what he should eat, and worried about him, you know, that he would get enough rice, enough food for the brain work that he was doing. Right. So she had. It seems that both the father and the mother seemed to see their oldest son, James, as they seemed to intuit that he really had a particular gift, or that he was extraordinary in some way, because he really got, you know, like an education and a way of, they interacted with him in a way that I don't think the others, certainly not the younger ones, but even Stanislaus didn't seem to have the same kind of nurturing that he got.
Yeah, there's no sense that the mother tried to force him into anything. I mean, you often have the Irish mother, you don't want the son to be a priest or a banker or a civil servant. There's never any sense of that. Joyce is a very autonomous individual from the get-go, and is encouraged, I think, as you're right, he's certainly encouraged by his father and mother to believe that he is something special, and they do look after him extraordinarily well, despite the increasing penury, you know, because I mean, as somebody said, you know, his father, you know, bred children as quickly as he did debt. I mean, he basically spent himself into poverty, something that Joyce himself picked up, you know. But you mentioned Ulysses there in the second chapter. It's an extraordinarily painful death for his mother from cancer, and Joyce is there pretty much throughout it. But he won't bend at the end. He's decided to leave religion behind. And even though he loves his mother, he cannot, you know, bend the knee, as it were, right at the end, even though she's on her deathbed.
He said, like, it's in the first chapter 2, where he relives in detail this horrendous death, like the whole sickness as she's dying from cancer, and her eyes staring at him, wanting him to pray, and he screams at, "No, mother, let me be and let me live. It's like, I have got to, I've made the break, and now I have got to." You feel that if he gets sucked in again, he just, you know, may never be able to walk away. So he is, I guess he's fighting for his artistic, not just his artistic soul, but his own individuality and what he has come to realize. And he has made a decision, and that decision is beyond reproach. It cannot be changed. But he suffers enormous guilt, I think, because, and of course, Buck Mulligan, you know, goes on and on about, you know, you couldn't kneel and pray when your mother asked you, you know, like, you know, you killed your mother, like, oh, you killed your mother and you can't wear gray pants, like, whoa, you know. So, and tells him that the Jesuit strain is injected in the money. It's in the
fearful Jesuit.
You're fearful Jesuit, yeah. So there's all, and of course, what Gogarty is doing is he's articulating the guilt that he feels. Why couldn't I? Of course. And then as he's walking along by himself later on, across Sandymount Strand, and he's thinking all things philosophical, you know, and ontological and every other on, and then he's thinking about drowning and how he, you know, he would never be able to drown someone. But then this line just comes up, and he thinks, I couldn't save her. There's one line in the middle of everything else, so you know that it's bubbling away underneath the whole guilt, and he carries that guilt throughout Ulysses. And then it appears again in the Bella Cohen scene when they go the red light district towards the end. And he's there absolutely, I mean, he's, you know, half cocked or more than, he's been drinking all day. And in the middle of it, as they're dancing around, then all of a sudden this image of his mother comes up. I mean, it's absolutely haunting. She's gaunt, gray clothes, a torn bridal veil, orange blossoms, you know, no eyes in the socket. And she's, you know, all she wants to do is get him to repent. Oh, Sacred Heart of Jesus, save him from the fires of hell. Repent, repent, repent. And again, he has to make a stand. And this time it's even stronger. It's like non serviam. I will not serve, which is the words of Lucifer. You know, it's like, I will not serve. So it's, and then smashes the chandelier, and that's the end of that. But it's a very, very, very powerful scene. It's like, it also shows the strength of the bond that he had with his mother, that it's taking this amount of psychic energy to separate himself from what she believed in.
Yeah.
And the church.
Her death comes after, you know, a kind of that crisis in his life where, you know, he has an encounter with a prostitute. I think he's only about 14 years of age. Now, of course, prostitutes do feature a lot in his literature and his thinking. And, you know, Dublin was a barracks town with a large British army, which generated, you know, very large, population of prostitutes. And indeed, the life of a prostitute was pretty rough, to be honest, you know, and not much protection from the police, but also not much interference from the police, because the police were afraid the army would go after them if they bothered their girls. But he has, at a very young age, this guilty sexual encounter with the prostitute, joins the sodality of the Virgin Mary at the same time, and he goes through a very pious period. So this is, you know, from 14, 16, 17, 18, he's going through this metamorphosis where he tries, in a way, I think, to suppress his sexuality and appetites, but ultimately can't do that. And so when he emerges from this process, it's then his mother dies, which is, in a way, the test. But he is aware of that dimension to relations with women, the sexuality, the prostitution, and that availability in Dublin at the time.
Yeah, but when you think about his social circle, like if he wanted to explore his sexuality, most of the women that he would encounter would be very nice middle class girls. You know, I mean, he was, you know, the sisters of the boys he went to, you know, Clongowes or Belvedere with. So
the Sheehy's and so on, yeah.
And so there was absolutely no way you wouldn't get to first base with, you know, these nice girls. So I guess the thing is, though, it always struck me that 14 seems an incredibly young age to, like, just to have the self-confidence or the guts to buy yourself to go out along by the canal and figure out how you pick up a prostitute, you know?
I know most guys would run a mile at that age.
Yeah, you're terrified. But then obviously, again, you know, he had extraordinary luck in the people, particularly the women, but also a lot of the men that he encountered. It was like, you know, so he probably, yes, there was all this guilt, you know, and sin. And of course, it was the big sin, still is, in, you know, but the fact that he would actually, you know, just go for it and say, but I think that, as I was saying, I think the women probably, because he was so young, were very nurturing and probably it probably was a wonderful way to be introduced to sex, would be, because I would imagine that these women were very loving towards him, and definitely in Portrait, you get that feeling that they were very caring
Caring, yeah. I mean, his Aunt Josephine on his mother's side was
Yeah.
a huge support to him as well, and you get that from the letters he writes to her, that he had a mature and adult relationship with her. You know, he got a lot of sustenance from that, and so in a way, probably his encounter with the prostitute does two things. It liberates him at one level, and then sets up this tension with the Catholic Church, with its belief and its demands, which ultimately he rejects. But this is really the engine of his aesthetic, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that if he hadn't, you just wonder. It's like, I think that because he had explored his sexuality, that when he encounters Nora, it's that he knows himself.
Yeah.
He knows himself well enough to recognize what an extraordinary woman Nora is, and how liberated she is sexually, that she doesn't suffer from that guilt thing, which he did. I mean, the confession scene in Portrait, where he's just absolutely destroyed by guilt, and oh my God, I've sinned. And, you know, and the retreats, of course, would focus on the sixth and ninth commandment. So, I mean, he's just, you know, shredded with guilt. But then he meets Nora, who doesn't seem to carry this for some extraordinary reason. Now, part of it may be, I don't know, maybe the west of Ireland. I think that this is probably a bit of a stretch, but there were different attitudes. The west of Ireland was a little wilder in some ways, because the Celtic consciousness lasted so much longer there than it did on the East Coast. And also, when you just think about, like, say, Yeats advising Synge to go to the west of Ireland to discover the true Celtic and the true Gaelic spirit, and he sent him off to the Aran Islands. Well, the Aran Islands was just, you know, sort of a hop, skip, and a jump from Galway City, and then there was the Gaeltacht. All those areas were very cut off. So I think a lot of that spirit. So, you know, she seems to have, and it may well have been part of that kind of the culture that she grew up in and the people that she encountered, that she didn't carry that Jansenistic, you know, Catholic, you know, terror of sex and the chaos that it could cause. So I think that when they met and he realized that this woman is completely at ease in her own body, in her own sexuality. It's just part of herself, and it's as natural as breathing. I mean, it must have been an extraordinary discovery, and I think that was a huge connection for them.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, he's walking down Nassau Street, 10th of June, 1904, and sees her, and then strikes up a conversation. So he's obviously immediately attracted to her, and I think he's at the time, he knows he's fallen in love, which is very, I mean, I think Stanislaus reports this as well. It's a very unusual emotion for the attraction he has to Nora. She stands him up for the first date, but then meets him on the 16th, which becomes Bloomsday. But, you know, she's only 6 months in Dublin, more or less fled from her family circumstances and a tyrannical Uncle Tommy, you know. But you're right, she seems to have this inner strength. I mean, you think about her life in the future, you know, she throws her lot in with a writer who she's never quite convinced he's a genius. I think she says, well, he's the strangest man I've ever met. I'm not sure he's a genius. And she goes off, and you talked about the kind of straight lines. She goes off without marrying him. And effectively, 6 months in Dublin, and, you know, some months later or whatever, heads off out into the wide world with this character. I mean, she is an extraordinarily free spirit.
Exactly. And doesn't tell anybody she's leaving, gets on the boat. He's there, the Aunt Josephine and the father waving him off. Then when the father finds out that this Nora Barnacle is actually going with him, I mean, his comment was, Barnacle by name and Barnacle by nature, she'll stick with him.
She'll stick with him.
and of course she did. But it was the thing is, the amazing thing is that each of them recognized in the other somebody that they had been searching for, looking for. It was like they met their, you know, in modern terms, their life partner. But there was something that they were like kindred spirits that recognized each other, and the trust and that bond was unshakable. But also the interesting thing is Nora had boyfriends in Galway. Like she was very attractive, you know, and to men and women, and had this wonderful. I mean, I read an interview with one of the books about it from a friend of hers, and the friend talked about how fabulous it was to hang out with Nora, and they would do things like one time they got into men's clothing, put their hair up under a hat and walked around Galway and nobody recognized them. They were very kind of free, independent spirits. That was not a usual kind of way to be.
No, that was Mary O'Halloran, I think, was her friend who very fondly recalled her. That's right. And they got up to very funny scrapes, you know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was
and it was over a boyfriend, a Protestant boyfriend, that the uncle, you know, beat her actually with a walking cane, and that's when she decided, enough of this, I'm gone. You know. Yeah.
But you know, the other point I think is that Joyce felt a tremendous loneliness after his mother dies, which in a way ends with Nora, and this is part of the bond. But he also said, when asked, you know, many years later, you know, is it what you had in common with Nora that kept you together? And he just scoffed and said, no, of course not. It's what was different between us, because she's not intellectual at all, makes no bones about this. You know, she's very grounded.
Yeah, she may not be an intellectual, but she was a very intelligent woman.
Yeah.
And she had, I mean, oodles of horse sense. I mean, she was grounded, she was the rock, and she didn't suffer fools gladly. She was not in awe of him. I mean, he writes to his auntie Josephine at one stage, very dejected. He said he just doesn't understand her. She just sees him as a man among men. Like, basically what he's saying is, she doesn't see how exceptional I am, you know.
Which annoyed him, but probably ultimately fundamentally attracted him. But he was irritated by it very often, you know. Yeah, you don't recognize my genius, because all husbands feel the same, let me assure you.
But there's a wonderful tribute that he made to her. He says, everything that is noble and exalted and deep and true and moving in what I write, I believe comes from you. Now, isn't that the most beautiful tribute that somebody could make? I mean, he recognized that she had qualities that he hugely respected. Also, she was a wonderful storyteller. She had all these stories about, you know, growing up. And I mean, he was, you know, charmed by the stories. And then they used her story of Michael Fury in dying for love of her, like the singer who gets just before she's leaving Galway, and she finds out later that he's dead. And that whole, and of course what Joyce does with that in The Dead is just so exquisite. But he was haunted by, and he also writes in his letters to the Auntie Josephine, that the idea that there were two boyfriends she had that subsequently died, but particularly the Michael Fury character.
Sonny Bodkin, I think was his name.
Yeah. And that she was, and he was also buried in Rahoon, but Oakdarad is a much nicer, you know, name.
Yes.
But it's got much more music to it. But she's, you know, he was jealous of these dead lovers, and he tells this to the Auntie Josephine. Of course, that's another thing about Joyce, is the letters that he wrote to the Auntie Josephine, and then later on to Harriet Shaw Weaver. He would pour his soul out. He had tremendous ease at talking about his feelings, and what was not just about his writing.
But his life.
But his life and his concerns and his fears and what was annoying him and what was worrying him, and what, you know, and his own shortcomings, like in terms of within the family. It was he had a tremendous facility to connect with and totally trust, and saw them as equals.
Equals, really.
Like, yes.
You do get that. And even with Nora, he did admire her facility with the language, with being able to tell stories. He admired her capacity to describe things And I think he once chided her for mimicking another kind of tone and borrowing. And he said, no, no, just speak as you do, you know. And you get that from people in the West, you know. I remember my grandmother had a great turn of phrase. No matter what it was, I mean, her son came with our grandchild and she was saying, oh, stuck to him like a butterfly. And she just rolled these things off, you know. And I could just imagine, my granny was kind of from Roscommon, not far, and there is that storytelling capacity, that understanding of humanity and of life and of tales being told and so on, which Nora obviously brought to Joyce. It was like a well almost, you know. But you mentioned the letters. I mean, I'm looking over Elmond's biography, and when you go, I went in the index to look up Harriet Shaw Weaver. Like the index is enormous, and you read these letters that he's writing to Weaver. Now we should explain, of course, that Harriet Weaver is introduced to Joyce via Ezra Pound. Ezra Pound was a great advocate for Joyce. I think it's, what is it, 1914 or something, or 15, or maybe is it 17? Anyway.
Yeah, I think it's 14 when she had taken over the Egoist. Yeah.
The Egoist, the publication, right?
Yeah.
So she's a funny mix, Harriet Shaw Weaver. She's got money, obviously. She's an editor of the Egoist. Very strict upbringing, but a very liberal, libertine kind of approach to modern art, which he was fascinated by. So she becomes his lifelong patron, extraordinarily generous. But he writes to her these enormous long letters with real candor. And you don't get the sense he's just writing to her to keep her happy as a patron. No. He's writing to her as a companion, as a counselor. You know,
a confidant. Yeah, exactly.
Confidant, exactly.
Yeah. In another era, we would have called it a therapist, but it's true. And she had tremendous. She could talk to him about the problems in his life, but also she would talk to him about what he was writing. And that I think she is one of. I describe these women as like midwives of Ulysses, because in all kinds of different ways they brought it into being. I find her the most extraordinary. I mean, this Quaker woman, the money, it seems, came, I just read recently, her grandfather, it came from cotton. He made a fortune in cotton. And she lived a very, very simple life, very, very frugal. But she obviously, like, in the early days when she took over the Egoist, they were publishing chapters of portrait, you know, and then paying him. So of course it was a way that he was making money. Also, it was keeping him writing. So because he had an outlet, he had a place where it was going to be published.
Just to pause on this for a moment, because we have to remember, he couldn't find a printer, not mind a publisher, for a portrait. Right. And she steps in and says, which the Egoist never did, she said, why don't we publish this as essentially our first book? Yeah. And you have to think, and it forces him to finish the chapters, but he's assured it's going to be in print. He finishes the book. She publishes it, which is his breakthrough in a way. And so in a very, very direct way, she's obviously got he's got other advocates like Pound and Yeats and so on. But she takes a very direct role in getting a portrait published. And then sends
there were two steps. The first one is she couldn't get it published in England initially, but there was an American publisher. So they sort of split the risk. Right. She said she would take 750 copies or whatever. So
if this guy printed it,
if he printed it, and then she would take the sheets from that and then have it printed in England, and did the same with Dubliners. So that was extraordinary. But then the most amazing thing is he suddenly was getting all this money through a solicitor from an anonymous donor, like £1,500, which was, you know, a king's
amounts of money,
5,000 chunks, these huge chunks of money. And then finally he figures out, or is told, who the benefactress is, but they haven't met at this time. Right. But she continued to fund that. She bankrolled that family basically all the way through, all the way through, which is amazing. It seems she would cut her own expenses in order that they would have money. She invested a huge chunk, and then he would get like a monthly amount, and that plus his royalties. She thought he would have enough to live on. Of course, she was absolutely astounded when she did finally go to Paris.
See how he was spending the money.
Lifestyle. I mean, the family going out to the best restaurants, and they're drinking, which she just could not believe, and the tipping. I mean, when Joyce had money, there was nobody more flahoola. He just,
Sure. Nora used to fight with him because he'd be tipping bellhops and ushers. But again, going back to Weaver, she's this very prudish woman. There was a famous story told of her when she was getting a medical examination in her bedroom. She had to turn all the photographs of the men, including Joyce, to the wall because she didn't want to be examined naked with men looking at her. And yet she is prepared to publish what at the time was regarded as essentially obscene publications. And she goes through this extraordinary length to get this avant-garde writer published while maintaining this very prim, as you say, frugal lifestyle. I mean,
I think there were two parts. There were two parts of her brain. There was her life and that, but then as an editor, publisher of a magazine, she had a huge appreciation for modernist writing and certainly for Joyce's writing. The only thing she couldn't wrap her head around was Finnegan's Wake. And I mean, she liked the washerwomen scene and the Anna Livia Plurabella, but the rest she made a suggestion once that maybe an annotated edition would be a good idea. Well, I made that.
I have to say, I've got an awful lot of sympathy for her view. Anybody who's heard,
but she was so terrified that she had hurt him or insulted him. Over she goes to Paris to, smoothen things out and make sure that he, she didn't. And she would always, if she felt she'd overstepped the boundaries, she would always try and, make things okay again, because she did not want to lose that connection with Joyce. And she did try to publish Ulysses. I mean, she went all around to every printer in England. She even went to Virginia Woolf and the Hogarth Press, and they just sniffed at it and thought, no, a little too lowbrow for them.
That introduces us to Sylvia Beach, who ultimately does publish it. But of course, she's working with Weaver as well. But Sylvia Beach is another woman, in a way, this American expat in Paris, sets up her bookshop, Shakespeare & Co., has a relationship with Adrienne Monnier, who's an independent spirit as well, has her own. I think her first bookshop inspired Sylvia Beach. But again, absolutely instrumental in getting Ulysses published. It wouldn't have happened without her intervention.
Absolutely not. No.
She's going around to the Hemingways and all the writers in Paris at the time, essentially being a publicist, an unpaid PR advocate for Joyce. Joyce almost, in fact, become the leader of the avant-garde literary circle in Paris, which leads then to Ulysses. So Sylvia Beach, again, you would not have had Ulysses published, at least in the way that we know it, and with the encouragement that he got, without her.
Right, because Harriet Weaver had tried in England and had drawn a blank. Then in the States, they had the Little Review, which again was an intellectual literary magazine. They had published a number of chapters, including Nausicaa, the one Gertie MacDowell on Sandymount Strand. That was too much for the censors. So there were, again, two publishers were charged with obscenity and lost their case and were fined, I don't know, £50 or $50 or something each. And the publisher that she had set up to publish Ulysses in the States, well, that was it. No publishing. So Joyce comes in crying to Sylvia Beach, that's it. My book will never come out, the end of everything. And then she says, well, would you consider Shakespeare and Company publishing it? And of course, she was connected to because being an avant-garde modernist and knowing all of this, there was a publisher in Dijon. So that she knew, that she had a connection with, and she arranged with him that he would publish it. So, I mean, who else would have, there was nobody else around who would have done it. So heavens knows how long it would have, lain there in the doldrums before being published. So yeah, she was absolutely, but then she was a good businesswoman, because she said, okay, 1,000 copies and we will pre-sell it. Like there will be subscriptions. So as you say, all the rest of them. Bernard Shaw said that he wasn't prepared. He described it as a repulsive but accurate picture of Ireland.
That's right. Shaw was not impressed. Shaw once quipped that I didn't throw myself into the battle for life, I threw my mother, which is actually far more accurate of Joyce than it was of him, funnily enough. But yeah, I think that's an important point you make about the timing, though, as well, is that had Ulysses not been published then and had languished for a few years, it may have lost its moment. It may have not hit the moment in the way that it did when it was published. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. But then the amazing thing was, with all the problems with the publishers, the typists, there weren't enough typists, so there was a deadline. He wanted it on his birthday, February 2nd, 1922, it had to come out. And he had this thing about dates, and they were hugely symbolic and important to him. But so there weren't typists. Harriet Weaver gets the typist, hires the typist for him. Then he's reading the proofs. Well, he adds on another third of the book while doing the proof. So of course that sent everybody into a tailspin. Then even the cover, he was so particular. He wanted blue, the Grecian blue with white lettering on it. But the first ones, there were two green, there were two this, there were two that. So finally they got the correct blue. Now they couldn't do the 1,000. So by February 2nd, the printer could have two, he's thought 3 copies, but actually 2 copies arrived. He'd mail them. No, too risky. Send them by train. And Sylvia Beach, on the morning of February 2nd, left her apartment down to the train station by 7 o'clock to pick up these 2 copies, back to the Joyce apartment. He inscribes the first one for Nora, and Sylvia Beach gets the second one, and then back to the shop. And of course, everybody, I mean, it's a huge, big celebration of people coming in. It's finally published. Now, of course, there are all kinds of mistakes in it and that, but I mean, you've got French typesetters, with trying to put a book, trying to print a book like Ulysses.
With all the Dublin idioms and everything.
Yeah. So, I mean, you do excuse them, but it was Sylvia Beach who, she loved the whole idea of celebrating this, and it was she who coined Bloomsday, which I hadn't realized. Yeah.
No, I didn't. No. Interesting. Yeah. But you get a great sense that Sylvia Beach, and of course Weaver is getting lists of potential buyers and distributors.
Exactly.
They're like a team around him, in the same way as his mother had been, Nora was at home. They're the scaffolding around which he is creating this literature.
Extraordinary. I mean, he does say that the women in his life, were enormously instrumental and helpful. I mean, well, you couldn't but notice how.
Yeah, I mean, you also know so much more about Joyce through his letters to them. I mean, for a guy who grew up in a very male environment, even as I said, the tone of the family household was very male. His father's a very male character. He loves the horse racing and the gambling and the drinking and the singing and the carousing.
Yeah.
And when Joyce goes to his own carousing, it's all boys in a way. And yet, you go back to that point, he treats women as equals. He's writing to them, he's explaining himself to them, he's complaining to them, but he's also looking for their approval. He was quite hurt that Weaver didn't like Finnegan's Wake.
Yeah.
And he's constantly going, and of course, he's constantly trying to win their approval. I mean, he's also getting them to do things for him in the sense of, like, Josephine is asked to explore corners of Dublin and contribute to I mean, he's got them all kind of working for him. But there is that egalitarianism comes through. He understands that he needs them, and he treats them as equals. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you read these letters. the degree to which he needs them, that in the same way as he needed his mother, he needs this support. And if it's almost impossible to read his life and imagine his success without any of these women. They are truly enablers, because they're taking a guy who is untested, who is doing some extraordinary stuff. They're taking it's a very intellectually very courageous for them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it is. It's absolutely amazing when you think that this number of people would actually cross his path. But he said to somebody once that he said, I don't know, he said, chance plays a big part of my life. He said, I'm like the guy who walks along and hits his foot against something and looks down and sees it's exactly what he needs.
Right. Yeah.
Almost, it's almost like an intuitive thing of who is going to, I mean, I don't know, is it fair? I often thought about that, just the idea of, say, himself and Nora, like Nora's outside Finn's hotel, he's walking down the street. There's no way that they would ever encountered each other socially. That would not have happened. Just the idea that at that particular moment, she's out, he comes down, she thinks he's a Norwegian sailor, they talk, and you know what I mean? It's like, what are the chances? Like, what are the chances? What are the chances that he'd have an aunt like Aunt Josephine, who would do all this research? Even he'd ask her the most extraordinary things, like, could you go to 7 Eccles Street and just see if somebody could climb over the railing and just drop down 2 or 3 feet to open the door, as Bloom did, you know? And like it was, and then he'd ask her about people in Dublin. He'd say, just get out a sheet of foolscap and anything that you remember, just write it down. It doesn't matter, just put it all down, put everything down, and then just post it to me.
Yeah, because he's tapping into their memories. He's like a detective. It's not that he's right. In a way, he's not writing fiction. For him, he's not writing fiction.
No.
You know, he's not making this up.
No.
You know, at one level, you know. And so these women are providing this material for him. And of course, he's got Nora talking at home to him, and he's absorbing all of this.
Yes.
Now, he does have a tragedy then with Lucia, his daughter. And he's got enormous respect for her, and he really does refuse to believe that she has mental problems.
Yeah.
And I think it does lead to tension with Harriet Shaw Weaver. But just on Lucia, that is a very, very, that's where his life turns dark, when eventually she is clearly suffering from schizophrenia and so on. You know, a very tough time for him. And
he also sees himself in Lucia. Like they had an incredibly strong bond, and he sees, and I think there's also a certain amount of guilt, because I think he sees a lot of himself in her. Somebody, I think it was she actually went to see Carl Jung, and I don't know if it's Carl Jung or some other therapist that saw her, said that she has a similar temperament to her father, but she doesn't have the genius. And I think Carl Jung actually thought that Joyce, she was diagnosed as schizophrenic, which he completely refused to believe. But so I think it was Carl Jung that said Joyce is more than likely schizophrenic, but he's also a genius. So it's like you get away, or it's, you know.
In other words, Joyce's mind could contain the ferocity of his talent in a way that maybe his daughter couldn't. That she's equally talented, but more fragile in a way, and therefore not able to contain it in a sense.
Yeah, and she did her dancing. She would dance, like there were 3 years where she was dancing, and she was like a very modernistic. I mean, she really, people really respected when she did finally give her concert, you know, in that funny silver kind of fish suit that she designed for herself, and that, and this extraordinary music and movement, and that she was obviously incredibly creative, but she couldn't, you know, I think she only ever gave one huge big concert, and then, you know, was suffering all kinds of delusions. And then the whole business with Samuel Beckett, when she became obsessed with him and fantasized that the reason he was coming to the house was to see her. And then, I mean, that caused a huge split between Beckett and Joyce, which was, you know, really unfortunate. But
when you step back, then of course Molly Bloom is the kind of the apex, as it were, and Joyce in the soliloquy. I mean, the only thing we hear from Molly at the beginning of Ulysses is, I think it's MN. It's he's shouting up to her in the bed, but she's in the bed. Don't see her at all through the rest of Ulysses. I mean, she is kind of the Penelope character, although obviously she's an unfaithful Penelope in the book. But just, you might talk a little bit about who are the women who are informing Joyce to create this character of Molly. I mean, clearly Nora rejected the comparison. She said, I wasn't as fat as she was, but but clearly it is Nora, but it's Nora plus.
Yeah, but also there's no way that he could have written Molly. I mean, without the fact that Nora had obviously bared her soul to him, and I mean, so that through Nora he kind of understood what a woman was, or certainly what Nora was. And you can also hear her rhythms, the same way as you can hear her rhythms in Greta and in Anna Livia Plurabella. That Galway, that beautiful Galway music that they have in their voice, you can hear. But I also think too that because Nora grew up in the west of Ireland, and as I say, that was kind of the heart, and particularly around Galway and that Gaeltacht and all of that mishmash that would happen in Galway, that there was a really strong sense of the Celtic consciousness. And in the West Coast, traditions like the whole thing of Brigid as fertility goddess and all of that lasted much, much longer. And one of the reasons I can say that is because my mother grew up in Mayo in the 20s and 30s, and she was from a little townland called Holywell, which was the holy well of St. Brigid. And on the 1st of February in Bollock, the first day of spring, St. Brigid's Day, the women from the farms would collect around the well and they would drink from it. And then they would take some of that water back. And but then the Christian part of it came in, where they would circle around and say a decade of the rosary. But they would pray for things like a good harvest. They would pray the women who are pregnant that would have, it was very rooted in Brigid as the ancient Celtic goddess. Which had been, and then was later Christianized. But so I think that there are elements of that whole tradition of Brigid and woman as strong as goddess, as life force, powerful. I think that is part of what was in Nora and part of what probably came out of that Celtic tradition. And you do hear it when you look for it in Molly, it's there, it's very, very strong. It's like the fertility goddess dealing with birth and breastfeeding, and also the ancient Brigid, the Celtic goddess, was associated with the cow, as lots of ancient, like Isis and all of those were. So there is a section in the Molly soliloquy that talks about this, that I think where you can actually see a connection between the ancient goddess Brigid and Molly and Nora, that which I can
please do
read for you. Yeah,
please do.
Okay. I wonder, was Boylan satisfied with me? One thing I didn't like was him slapping me behind "go away" in the hall, though I laughed. I'm not a horse or an ass, am I? I think he made them a bit firmer, sucking them like that so long. He made me thirsty. Titties, he calls them. Stiff the nipple gets for the least thing. They're supposed to represent beauty, placed up there like those statues in the museum. Are they so beautiful? Of course, compared with what a man looks like with his 2 bags full and his other thing hanging down out of you, or sticking up at you like a hat rack. No wonder they cover it with a cabbage leaf. I had a great breast of milk with Millie, enough for 2. I had to get him to suck them, they were so hard. He said it was sweeter and thicker than cows. Then he wanted to milk me into the tea. How he's beyond everything. I declare somebody ought to put him in the budget. So that is one section where, you know, you are, and she even sees herself like one of those statues in the museum.
But it's also expresses how a woman cannot escape her body. You know,
Yes.
that she is the fertile bed for birth. She has a womb.
Yes. Yes.
You know, new people come out of her. You know, she's her period once a month. She's got lactating breasts. You know, I mean, in a way, she is embracing the fact that a woman is ultimately and intimately connected with her body in a way that a man can kind of ignore his body. You know, that he can kind of, his body doesn't make the demands of his psyche that a body does of a woman, because she's obviously very conscious of her life cycle in a way that a man isn't. You know, her fertile life cycle, that it will come to an end, her, you know, period of kind of sexual fruitfulness, as it were. But yeah, so Molly captures all of that in a way that is unabashed, totally commonsensical, and in a way celebratory, you know. But she's also puzzled by it in a way, like, are we that beautiful?
Yeah,
you know.
But again, she's very aware of being part of the great rhythm of life, the same way as Anna Livia's like flows into the Liffey that then, you know, will go up and will become cloud, will become rain, and become, it's this great big cycle of life that she's part of. But also there is another section where Molly is, this is kind of almost like pure Brigid, where like the goddess Brigid is associated with plants and growth and healing herbs and nature. And there's even now a St. Bridget's garden in Uachtarard outside Galway, which I just heard about. Right. Anyway, this is Molly. I love flowers. I'd love to have the whole place swimming in roses. God in heaven, there's nothing like nature. The wild mountains, then the sea and the waves rushing. Then the beautiful country with the fields of oats and wheat and all kinds of things, and all the fine cattle going about that would do your heart good to see. Rivers and lakes and flowers, all sorts of shapes and smells and colours. Nature it is. As for them saying there's no God, I wouldn't give a snap of me 2 fingers for all their learning. Why don't they go and create something? I often asked them. Atheists, or whatever they call themselves. Go and wash the cobbles off themselves first. Who was the first person in the universe before there was anybody that made it all? Who? Ha! That they don't know. Neither do I. So there you are. They might as well try to stop the sun from shining tomorrow. The sun shines, he said, the day we were lying among the rhododendrons on Holt Head, in the grey tweed suit and a straw hat. The day I got him to propose to me, yes. Okay, we'll end it there.
Yeah, it's great because I've just finished reading Circa by Stephanie Miller, which is a retelling of that story. And when you read the Iliad and the Greek tales, you do have these extraordinarily powerful women. Joyce was very taken with Athena, for example, and so he's very aware that the Greek cycle on which he's essentially basing Ulysses is full of goddesses and of witches and herbal medicines and that kind of thing, which, as you suggest, and I think quite rightly, he picks up in a kind of its raw Celtic form from Nora and her stories, and of Brigid and of that pre-Christian Gaelic society, because Gaelic Ireland up until the 5th century, certainly throughout the Iron Age, mimics and mirrors the classical ancient Greece. We know that from the Táin, we know it from the Brehon law tracts and so on. So in a way, Nora and Molly are Joyce's way of connecting that circle, because he's very familiar with the church, the masculine church. He's a big fan of Thomas Aquinas. He knows all
Right.
about the scholastics,
Yeah.
that kind of highbrow metaphysical world. And yet it's through Nora and women that ground him, but also then, as you suggest, connect him to this mythological view of the world, which is rooted in flowers and herbs and nature. And where is Molly at her most powerful? It's lying amongst the flowers, which of course famously Joyce didn't actually like flowers, but she's situated. That's her world,
Yeah.
in a sense, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I got him to marry me, you know.
And then ending the book on a yes. It's like yes to life, to the life force, to which, you know, and it's so perfect that it's Molly, who is kind of like a Mother Earth, that she says yes to life. It's a beautiful way to, you know, to end. And also it's kind of, it's beyond, it transcends the conventional religions. It's like it's bigger than, or it includes all of them and is bigger than all of them.
And we know that Joyce put a lot of thought into that, because he had this squabble with the French translator, who, and they were back and forth on this, and the French translator wanted to say je veux, oui, je veux, oui, and there was a back and forth, and eventually, of course, they agree, yes, it has to say, because Joyce always said yes is a female word. It's the word of women.
Yes.
Yes, you know.
Yeah.
So it's a very conscious way of bringing it back to a woman we don't really hear at the beginning of the book, but dominates it, because you mentioned Blazes Boylan. Well, and we should say this, Bloom is wandering around Dublin in a way avoiding going home, because he knows his wife is going to have an assignation, an affair with Blazes Boylan, and yet he's incredibly tolerant of this. He's I mean, the word was used complacent. I don't think it's complacent. It's almost, it's his understanding of human nature. He doesn't really hold it against her. It's almost ingratitude that he lives his life with this woman. And if she needs an affair, he's going to put up with it. You know, even on the morning of the day that he knows she's going to meet Blazes Boylan, he's asking her, "What do you like for breakfast?"
Right. Yeah, I think he doesn't. Also, I mean, because there's, you know, a sexual relationship ended with the death of Rudy and things changed between them, then there is, but so, I mean, there may be some guilt on his part, but he also, I think, doesn't feel threatened by Blazes Boylan the same way as Joyce, totally, apart from the one incident where he felt, you know, when he went back to Ireland first and Cosgrave, the friend, tried to tell Joyce that, oh, well, Nora was with you when, you know, you were dating every second night. Well, who do you think she was with all the other nights? That was me, you know, and totally almost destroyed him. And of course, Joyce writes all these, you know, all of these letters. But once that was over, and there was never any question after that, but there was total trust. But Joyce was aware that men found Nora very attractive.
Oh, yeah.
And he, you know, he kind of, I don't know, titillated him in a way.
I think he did. Yeah, I mean, the Dead is based on him kind of almost deliberately getting himself worked up about this memory of the dead, the dead Sonny Bodkin and so on. He almost wants to sharpen his feelings for Nora by imagining her infidelities. But of course, in reality, he was annoyed by what he described as her indifference. Of all her characteristics, the indifference is what kind of got him, you know, that you really don't care all that much, do you? You know, it's just this kind of search for, yes, I do. And of course, she's not going to give it to him, which I think at the end he kind of admires. And then the marriage is not all straight sailing. I mean, she does storm off at one point back to Ireland during the end of during the Civil War. But she's no sooner gone than he's writing her beseeching letters.
Yes.
You know, and he can't live without her.
He couldn't, no. And even when later on, when she was in hospital, she had cancer and she was having surgery, he couldn't to be separated and go home to the empty apartment without her. So he had them, you know, bring in a bed, and he, for the whole duration of her hospital stay, he slept in the bed beside her in the hospital ward.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it was, no, he was, they were totally devoted to each other. You know, you wonder, don't you, what would have Joyce, I mean, it's total speculation, but if they hadn't actually met, what, you know, what influence or how would that have changed Joyce, his life, what he wrote about, what, like, what it's, I mean, it's, you know, you could sit and talk about it all day.
You can, but I think, I mean, well, first of all, you know, for a man, there are not many decisions he freely makes. I mean, basically, the wife you pick and the house you buy are probably the two most independent. After that, most things are contingent on something else. So the real stroke of genius for Joyce is spotting Nora, immediately seeing she's the woman for me when nobody else really saw it. Nobody else did. I mean, here is, you know, she's clearly got a lot of characteristics, but none that you would say were the classic characteristics of an admirable woman in that society. You know, the well-educated, prim, you know, good for sewing and singing and piano. You know, he found something. He's looking for something else, and he finds it. But you're right. I mean, what if he didn't? It's hard to imagine Joyce coping with life and being able to write the books he wrote without all of that support that he was getting. You know, the money from Harriet Shaw Weaver, the support and the opportunity to get published by her and by Sylvia Beach. You know, Nora at home holding things together. You know, the support he got from his aunt. You know, and the grounding and stability he got from his mother, which he was never going to get from his father. You know. Yeah. And it's not to denigrate the father, but who gives him all of these stories, this lore, this history when they were in Dublin. But it's almost impossible to imagine Joyce being enabled to do what he did without these very powerful women in his life.
Yeah, yeah. And the great miracle is that he found what he needed. That it was it all, you know, in some wonderfully miraculous kind of way, the people that he needed came. And then, you know, even like in Paris, when he's supposed to go there for 6 months and they arrive, and then there's the whole Sylvia Beach and Shakespeare and Company, and then, you know, Ezra Pound, who promoted him all over the place. And so he's introduced to all these influential people, like, and the critics. So therefore, even when his books come out, they know who to send it to, who will do reviews of his books that will, I mean, it was, he was extraordinarily blessed in his life.
Well, he was, but I think we have to bring it back to the fact that whatever Joyce had, people saw it.
They recognized.
It's not as if you get any great sense of why they were impressed with him, because the way they're impressed with him is that they know this guy has an extraordinary mind, that he is an extraordinary figure, in the same way as his mother and father recognized it.
Yes.
In the same way, even though you know, Harriet Shaw Weaver saw it in his writing, and of course heard it from Pound as well, and wanted to be part of a avant-garde movement and one of the world's greatest writers. But they clearly all saw something in Joyce, or Joyce was able to share something of himself in that unpretentious way, the direct way that he had. So they clearly saw something in him.
Yeah. And enormous respect from him. And also too, it seems he was actually wonderful company. I mean, when he had a few drinks and he'd sing and all the rest of it, that he was, you know, he had a very charming side as well. You know?
Well, it brings us back to Dublin in a way, because, you know, Joyce's writings, they're not about Paris, they're not about Trieste, they're not about Zurich. It's about Dublin. And when you see those early scenes in his life where they're playing piano and they're singing songs and telling stories, you know, it reminds me of my uncles who were able to stand up and sing a song, you know, wonderful tenor voices and so on, that Joyce ultimately never left that Dublin at all, never left that milieu of family and friends. But it was interesting that at the end of Eamonn's biography, he says, you know, the two things that were the twin pillars of Joyce's life were his writing and his family.
And his family, yeah.
And yet, in a way, maybe Eamonn should have added his friends too, and the supporters like Harriet Shaw Weaver and Sylvia Beach and his Aunt Josephine, that it was
But you
wider
know,
than family.
yes, but I mean, I think maybe that is, you know, the other side, the flip side of genius or whatever. There was a sense of entitlement to some degree that, I mean, he never, like, he was shameless in asking for, I mean, you know, in asking for help and expecting help. And I think there was something, you see it a bit in George Bernard Shaw as well, like the mother going out, you know, not exactly scrubbing floors, but you know what I mean? Like, because there's a total belief, and maybe it comes with genius or this need to express, and whoever has to help or whoever has to facilitate it, so be it, but this must be stated. And so I think that because he could be very ungrateful to a lot of people that helped, like to Harriet Weaver Shaw. He could be very cruel in some of the things.
Yeah, it didn't end well.
No.
Even though she was the executor, she looked after Lucia.
Yes.
So he was very cool with her at the end. They did eventually fall apart.
Yeah,
you know.
and he's with most of the people that were, and then also with Sylvia Beach,
Yeah.
when he, you know, the rights were sold to Random House. And I mean, it had a huge impact on her life, because now suddenly she isn't getting, you know, all of this money from sales. I mean, yes, she got some small percentage of royalties, but she was so generous. I mean, she gave him 66% of the royalties on that first batch of, I mean, which is beyond generous. But so there was that. I mean, yes, you can understand as a writer, of course he wants bigger and better and get it out there and all the rest of it. But she struggled, like, really afterwards. And but the lovely thing was, I mean, there are two things. He would always remember, it seems, on February 2nd, she would receive a plant from him just as a thank you. But also
Weaver.
Sylvia Beach. Yeah. And then in 1954, when Michael Scott, an architect, bought the Martello Tower and gave it to, you know, Ireland that as a museum. So it was opened in 1954, and Sylvia Beach was invited as guest of honor. And it was hugely important to her. And she was, you know, she was given all the accolades and all the credit that she hadn't really been given before. And particularly for it to happen in Dublin with, you know, all of these people, some of whom would have known Joyce. And she died later that year, but it seems it was something that she wrote about, talked about, and was enormously grateful that it happened. So it did. That was a lovely ending to her contribution. You know.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a nice point for us to end too. That finally she did get that recognition, and the fact that we're talking about it today, I think they probably haven't been recognized enough over the decades, actually.
I agree. I don't think so. It's like, yes, I mean, as a writer, and Ulysses is an absolutely extraordinary book, but that you can read again and again and again, and just the levels and layers. And the amazing thing is that one consciousness could contain all of this,
all of that,
and then turn it into like a really, you know, compelling story. And then all these characters that are in there. I mean, I think there is a PhD thesis in all the characters, all of those, because they're so individualistic in terms of the way they speak, what they talk about, how they look, and that. Hundreds of them. Like,
no, it's extraordinary, because in a way it does something that history can't do, which is to bring people in Dublin alive, and it has stood the test of time. I mean, it's still 100 years later. You know, it's still avant-garde. It still has never been really repeated. And in a way, it's such a masterpiece. You wonder how any Irish writer has the nerve to start anything, you know. But and I think we should say that, you know, it is accessible in the sense of, you know, there are so many guides. In fact, my colleague Dan Hall has just written a reader's guide to Ulysses. There are other ones out there too. You know, people shouldn't be afraid of it. You know, this is the 100. It's a great time now to start reading the book, and there are plenty of supports out there. But also, the great attraction is that it is so immersive. It is such a pleasure and not to be afraid of it.
Yes, exactly. And I also think too, another one of the reasons why it has lasted is that, yes, it is about Dublin, but it is about cities. It just encapsulates what it is to live in a city. And I think anybody, and let's face it, most of the world is now living in, in cities. So just that the interconnectedness, the, sort of like the wandering rocks where all these lives kiss, cross and all, that whole thing is, I mean, it's astonishing. On some
which is very nice, because in Irish history and Irish society, we've never really known what to do with cities. Dublin is not core to our national identity in the way that Paris is to France, or Berlin to Germany, or London to England.
Right.
And yet Joyce takes Dublin and gives it its due prominence in a way that other commentators and other disciplines have never done. They've minimized, in a sense, the role of Dublin. And Joyce takes it and polishes it into this piece of literature,
Yeah,
right. Well, listen, Mary, that was fantastic. Really enjoyed that. Your readings were beautiful.
Thank you.
And I'm glad that you wove in Brigid, who's a very powerful character in Irish history, and rightly, I think, becoming an icon for women today, and being celebrated, if not quite with the same prominence as St. Patrick, but getting up there. So we have a much nicer balance between the patriarchal and the female force.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's I love the way you brought the kind of Brigid into the story of Molly via Nora. I think that's a really great contribution to the celebration of St. Brigid's Day. And of course, there's a lot of other panel discussions and events going on around that, which is great to see, But listen, Mary, thanks again. We look forward to maybe another chat closer to Bloomsday for the 100th anniversary.
Okay.
We'll be doing something together. And great to chat with you.
Okay. Thank you.